Here's William Lane Craig to give a summary of his favorite goofy arguments that don't work and have been debunked a million times. If you're not familiar with William Lane Craig, in this video he lists pretty much every argument he has, and I explain why they are all silly.
And so how would you engage an agnostic when you start answering the questions of the existence of God, and how do you get them engaged in that discussion? Because they go, it's not humanly possible for us to answer that question.
I would encourage every Christian to have a list of arguments memorized that he can share with an unbeliever. The typical unbeliever, in my experience, has no good reason for his unbelief. He's simply been taught to repeat the slogan, "There's no good evidence for God's existence." And this is really, I think, a mask for intellectual laziness on his part. But it serves very effectively as a conversation stopper because the average Christian doesn't have any good evidence for God's existence.
The average Christian doesn't have any good evidence for a God's existence, but it's the average atheist who is the intellectually lazy one, apparently.
And so this, in effect, gives the atheist the trump card. There's no evidence for God's existence, and that's the end of the conversation. But if you will have a list of arguments memorized at that point, what you can do is say to the unbeliever with a surprised look on your face, "Well, is that what you think? Why, I can think of at least 5 arguments for God's existence."
Which is kind of a non sequitur, given that the original assertion was that there is no good evidence, not that there are no good arguments.
And at that point, he's got to say, "Yeah, like what?" And then you're off and running. So when people ask me, "Well, there's no evidence for God's existence," and I say, "Well, sure there is," and they say, "Well, like what?" I typically just list about 5 arguments. I'll say, God is the best explanation for why anything at all exists, rather than nothing.
How is the idea of a timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind a good explanation for anything, let alone the best explanation for anything? This is typically how Craig describes God. It's not clear at all to me what it means to say that something timeless and spaceless exists. To say that something exists seems to me to mean that it has extension and or location in time and space. If that's not what existence is, then what does it mean to say that anything exists? And a mind is a pattern of activity that brains carry out. To say that a God is a mind which is disembodied seems to me to mean that a God is a pattern of activity that a brain carries out that no brain carries out. It seems like a contradiction to me. Given that the idea of a God, at least as Craig conceives of one, is self-contradictory in these respects, it is far from clear to me how such a notion can be any kind of explanation for anything.
God is the best explanation of the beginning of the universe.
This assumes that the beginning of the universe requires a cause. The beginning of the universe is not like any other example of a beginning, however. Usually when a thing begins to exist, there's a point in time when that thing did not exist, followed by a point in time when it does. In other words, a change occurs. When such a change occurs, it makes sense to ask what caused it. However, the beginning of the universe is different because it is also the beginning of time. There was never a time when the universe did not exist. Since there was no point in time at which the universe did not exist, there was no change from a point in time at which it did not exist to a point in time at which it does. If no such change occurred, then there is no reason to account for any such change. You don't need to explain an event which never occurred. The beginning of the universe is just a temporal limit rather than an event at which something comes into existence. It is not a beginning in that sense. The universe no more came into existence at the Big Bang than a yardstick comes into existence at its first inch.
God is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life.
The idea that the universe is fine-tuned for intelligent life is predicated upon the idea that if the parameters, that is, the constants and laws, of the universe were even slightly different than they are now, intelligent life would be impossible. Since a universe which is even slightly different than the one we have could not support intelligent life, some intelligent being must have deliberately fine-tuned it for that purpose. There are a few problems with this, but 2 of the most glaring are ones which undermine the very theology that assumes a God's existence existence in the first place. First, God is supposedly all-powerful. To infer that no intelligent life is possible in a universe with even slightly different parameters implies that God is not capable of creating life in such a universe. An all-powerful God shouldn't need to fine-tune something for life. He should have the power to put life in any universe. Secondly, is God himself not a form of intelligent life? If he is, then it is clearly not the case that it is impossible for intelligent life to exist without a finely tuned universe, because the existence of God himself is not supposed to be contingent upon any universe, let alone a finely tuned one. And if immaterial intelligence doesn't count as intelligent life, then why do Christians tell us that our souls will have eternal life in heaven? Another reason that fine-tuning is a poor argument is that while we can imagine a universe with different parameters than the one we currently see, we don't actually know for sure that these hypothetical other parameters are equally probable or even possible. It may be the case that the parameters of the universe have never been free to vary, or that they could only vary narrowly, making this universe's parameters either necessary or at least probable. This certainly seems to me to be a much more modest and probable inference than the intervention of a timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind.
God is the best explanation of objective moral values and duties in the world.
This argument is entirely toothless when presented to someone who believes in neither objective moral values or a God. When asked why we ought to believe in objective moral values, Craig has presented two arguments. One is, deep down we all know it, which is laughable, and the other is, there are objective moral values because God exists, which, as I said, is not going to convince anyone who believes in neither. Also, even if there is a God who dictates moral values, that doesn't make them objective because there is still no objective reason why anyone ought to follow them. Craig sometimes argues that something is moral not because God says so, but rather because it is consistent with God's nature. But what objective reason is there to do things which are consistent with a God's nature? If there is a reason which is independent of God, then it isn't true that there aren't any objective moral duties without a God. If the reason why we ought to do what is consistent with God's nature is because doing so is consistent with God's nature, then the argument is circular.
God is the best explanation of the historical facts concerning Jesus of Nazareth.
Craig believes that the, at best, second-hand testimony, which floated around orally for years before being written down, describing Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, are best explained by the existence of a God. Again, it's unclear how a timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind is the best explanation for anything, but it is even less clear how it is the best explanation for hearsay talk of a resurrection. Error and embellishment are very probable explanations for claims of a resurrection, both of which make more sense than divine intervention. Secondly, even if it were the case that Jesus did rise from the grave, it is still a non sequitur to infer that this means that he is the incarnation of a God. Even if he has the supernatural power to return from the dead, you can't rationally infer from this that he is therefore an all-powerful deity.
And finally, God can be personally known and experienced.
Sometimes Craig refers to this as the witness of the Holy Spirit, which, as best I can tell, is a kind of woo-woo feeling of the presence of a God or some such thing. This is also unlikely to convince an atheist because it's unlikely that an atheist has these feelings. And even if one did, it's rather silly to think that it is evidence of the existence of a God. In what other case are subjective intuitions taken as evidence of anything other than the existence of subjective intuitions?
And I find that many times just giving a list of the arguments is enough to satisfy the unbeliever. He doesn't even ask to hear the arguments. Just hearing a list of them is often enough.
In other words, Craig gives this list, and non-believers are like, all right, I've heard enough from you. Next, Craig elucidates his favorite argument, the Kalam cosmological argument.
So I would encourage all of us to have such a list memorized that you can just share at the drop of a hat with an unbeliever. Now, if he does want to press you, each one of those points in the list has an argument that has premises or steps that you can memorize and again then share with them. For example, the argument that God is the best explanation for the beginning of the universe is very easy to memorize. It has just 3 steps. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause.
The first premise is false, as I've already explained. Only things whose existence is preceded by a point in time at which they did not exist need a cause.
And that will show that we don't live in an isolated system, that there is a transcendent cause beyond space and time, beyond the universe that has brought the universe into being, which has obvious theological implications.
What exactly does it mean to say that something is beyond space and time? Beyond is a spatial orientation. It's a contradiction to say that something is literally beyond space itself. That makes no sense. Perhaps Craig is using the word beyond metaphorically, but if that's the case, it's not clear what he intends to mean. If he means that God is not inside space and time, then it's not clear what it would mean to say that he exists at all.
So, if you have these premises memorized, then you are prepared to actually share the argument with the unbeliever. But in many cases, you won't even need to do that if you just have a list.
By the time you've gotten to the end of the list, your interlocutor probably will have either fallen asleep or realized that they didn't want to be proselytized to, and has walked away having regretted ever bringing it up in the first place. Also, having a list of arguments that have been handed to you by William Lane Craig is totally not intellectually lazy. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.